Welcome to the Gold and Blue Tube Playoff Poll, week number 2. And this week, I thought I would come up with what I like to call the chaos meter. There's 5 levels to it. There's no chaos, there's minimal chaos, there's moderate chaos, extreme chaos, and 2007 chaos. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it. 2007 was one of the craziest years in college football. So that is the standard that I judge chaos on from week to week. For this week, I put the chaos meter at moderate. You had the upset of Penn State that Minnesota delivered. Also, Baylor stayed undefeated. So, not extreme chaos, but there was some chaos in there. I'm going to get to my week 2 playoff poll, but I wanted to look at what the playoff committee came up with this week. And this is what their top 10 look like, if you don't already know. Number 10 is Oklahoma, 9 Penn State, 8 Minnesota, 7 Utah, number 6 is Oregon, number 5 Alabama, number 4 Georgia. You'll see why I rolled my eyes here in just a minute. Number 3 Clemson, number 2 Ohio State, and number 1 LSU. So before I get into my top 10 for this week, I wanted to go ahead and mention that I had to kick 2 people out, 2 of the teams out, because Minnesota and Baylor remained undefeated, and I had to reward that. So the 2 teams that I kicked out was Georgia and Michigan. Michigan was easy. They have 2 losses. They're out. Now for Georgia, they're one of those one-loss teams. So what I looked at was, number 1, their loss. They have the worst loss of any of the 1 losses. South Carolina at home. I can't excuse that for now. They can still make that up, but that is a terrible, terrible loss. I know they beat Florida. That's a decent win. And they beat Notre Dame. I don't think that's as good a win as we thought it was, because Michigan recently crushed Notre Dame. So, Georgia, Michigan, you're out of my top 10. So now I'm going to get into my top 10 for this week. Number 10 is Oklahoma. They have wins against Texas and Iowa State. Decent wins. And then they have a loss at Kansas State. The loss at Kansas State is not as bad as the loss Georgia had against South Carolina at home. That's why I have Oklahoma at 10 and Georgia is slightly out. Now, Oklahoma's remaining schedule is at Baylor versus TCU at Oklahoma State. So they have a chance to improve their resume as well, just like Georgia. So let's move on to number 9. Number 9 is Baylor. They remain undefeated. They have decent wins against Iowa State, Kansas State, and Oklahoma State. Both the Kansas State and Oklahoma State wins were on the road. So that's pretty good. Their remaining schedule is Oklahoma at home versus Texas and at Kansas. So that game versus Oklahoma in Waco, that's going to be a very important game. That could decide Baylor's fate for the rest of the season. Although I do anticipate that if that does play out, that they'll end up playing Oklahoma again at the end of the year. And if Baylor goes undefeated and has 2 wins against Oklahoma, there's no way you can leave them out. But for right now, I have Baylor at number 9. At number 8, I have Penn State falling all the way down from number 2 last week. Excuse me, I forgot to mention, Oklahoma is at number 10. They fell from number 8. And Baylor is at number 9, and they came up from not being ranked in my poll. Got that out of the way. Penn State was my number 2 team last week. They fell all the way down to number 8. They have good wins against Pitt, at Iowa, versus Michigan. And then that loss at Minnesota. That's not a terrible loss. That's why I kept them in my top 10. But they did fall all the way down to number 8. Their remaining schedule is versus Indiana, at Ohio State. There's a chance to redeem themselves right there. And versus Rutgers. So don't count Penn State out yet, because if they win at Ohio State and then go to the Big Ten championship, guess what? They could play Minnesota again and redeem that loss. So don't count them out yet. They're still in the picture. I had to drop them though. So Penn State from number 2 all the way down to number 8. Number 7 is Utah. Last week they were number 7 for me. Kept them the same. Not much really going on with Utah last week. They have wins against Washington State, Arizona State, and Washington. Nothing to brag about, just kind of there in the middle. And then a loss at USC. Not a horrific loss, but not a great loss either. No loss is great, but it's better than losing to South Carolina at home. Their remaining schedule is versus UCLA, at Arizona, versus Colorado. So we'll see if they can go into the Pac-10 championship, Pac-12 championship as a one-loss team against Oregon possibly. At number 6, I have Alabama. Last week I had them ranked at number 5. I actually sort of anticipated them losing to LSU, so this is not really a big surprise to me. They have a decent win at Texas A&M, and then that loss to LSU at home. Not horrible. LSU is the number 1 ranked team in the playoff poll, so that's not a horrible loss. But that first half, they looked pretty bad, especially the last 2 minutes of the first half. Their remaining games are at Mississippi State versus Western Carolina, and then at Auburn. So it'll be interesting to see if LSU stumbles down the stretch. They would have to stumble majorly for Alabama to make the SEC championship, but chaos happens. So we'll see what happens with that, and then, if a one-loss non-champion Alabama can sneak in there. They're not completely out of it yet, but they have a lot of work to do, and some things have to happen in their favor. They fall from 5 to number 6 in the Golden Blue Tube playoff poll. For number 5, here's the big jumper, Minnesota. Last week I didn't have them ranked in my top 10 poll. This week I have them at number 5. They're still undefeated, and they have that massive win against Penn State. I had to reward them. Stayed in the ranks of the undefeateds, but still barely on the outside looking in as far as the playoffs go. If they can run the table, they're in. Their remaining schedule is at Iowa, at Northwestern, versus Wisconsin. And don't overlook that at Iowa game, because Iowa is a place where a lot of good teams, their dreams go to die. So if Minnesota can survive that, then they're sitting pretty. That Wisconsin game at the end, though, still might be a little tricky. For right now, Minnesota goes from non-ranked to number 5 in my poll. And actually, they are the Cinderella story that I'm secretly rooting for. So, fingers crossed. Hopefully they can make it to the Big Ten championship undefeated and upset possibly Ohio State. We will see. Number 4 for the Golden Blue Tube top 10. Last week I had Oregon at number 6. This week I have them at number 4. I think they're the best one-loss team out there as far as resume and the way they look on the field. That's another thing about Georgia. Not just that they lost to South Carolina, but they don't look very good right now. We'll see if they can improve on that. For Oregon, they do look good. They have decent wins over Washington, Washington State, and at USC. The only loss they have is the one versus Auburn at the very beginning of the season. If you're going to lose, that's when you want to lose. And Auburn, they're a pretty decent team to lose to. So as far as the one-loss teams go, for me right now, Oregon is the best. For their remaining schedule, they have versus Arizona, at Arizona State, versus Oregon State. So the only trip up before the Pac-12 championship could possibly be at Arizona State. Arizona State plays good defense, but as of late, not looking very good. So Oregon climbs from number 6 to number 4 in my poll for this week. Number 3, same team as last week, Clemson. They just keep winning. They just keep surviving. Nothing to brag about. Decent win against Texas A&M, but they are undefeated. They are the defending national champions. Their remaining schedule is versus Wake Forest. I don't see them having any trouble with them. Wake Forest is faltering a little bit. And then at South Carolina. South Carolina is a bad team, but they did sneak up on Georgia in Athens. So stranger things have happened. Right now, I have Clemson at number 3. I think they can go undefeated and skip right on into the playoffs. We shall see. For number 2, there's a little bit of change here as well. For number 2, I have Ohio State. Last week, I had them at number 1. This week, I have them at number 2. I'm not punishing them or anything. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just the way things happened last week. They're still undefeated. Last week, I had them at number 1. They still have good wins against Cincinnati, Michigan State, and Wisconsin. And their remaining schedule is at Rutgers versus Penn State and at Michigan. So the back end of their schedule will test them, so we can see if they'll get into the Big Ten Championship undefeated or maybe one loss. I think undefeated is more likely, and hopefully they'll end up playing Minnesota in the Big Ten Championship. This brings us to the Gold and Blue Tube number 1 for this week, and that is going to be the LSU Tigers. They were number 2 last week. They jumped to number 1. We all know why. Beating Alabama at Alabama. That is impressive. To go along with wins against Florida at home and Auburn at home. Add on to that a win at Alabama. LSU is number 1. That is very impressive. The remainder of their schedule, however, not impressive. At Ole Miss versus Arkansas versus Texas A&M. So LSU would really have to pull a stinker to not get into the SEC championship, and I expect them to be undefeated. That would be some major upsets if any one of those 3 teams could beat LSU. I don't see it happening. I see LSU going to the SEC championship undefeated, probably playing Georgia. I'm going to say a 2-loss Georgia. I think they'll lose at Auburn. That remains to be seen. So I think it'll be an undefeated LSU against a 2-loss Georgia. And I'm telling you, if a 2-loss Georgia wins the SEC championship, that's when major chaos will break out. People will be scratching their heads trying to figure that one out. Do you leave out an SEC champion, even though they're, 2 losses? 1 loss, Pac-12, undefeated Big 12, 1 loss Big 10, if that turned out. So that is something to keep an eye on. I don't think that'll happen, but I'm just saying that's one of the craziest scenarios that I can think of. So we'll see where the chaos goes from here. For now, that's it for me. Thank you for joining me. I want to see you on my next video.